They say you don't really know a man until you've seen him at his worst. But I think you don't know a man until you've seen the choice he makes when no one is watching. For Clayton Morse, that choice was lying in the dirt just outside his fence line, bleeding from two different arrow wounds. The boy couldn't have been more than 16. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. War paint, meant to make him look like a fearsome warrior, was smeared with sweat and dirt, making him look like what he was, a scared kid a long way from home. Clayton stood on his porch, the familiar weight of his rifle in his hands. 45 years he'd been on this earth, and every single one of them had taught him the same lesson. Mind your own business, especially when that business came with tribal markings and a trail of blood. The other ranchers, men he shared a drink with on Sundays, had a simple policy, unspoken, but as solid as the mountains to the west. If you see one of them on your land, you shoot first. You don't ask questions. You don't offer help. You end the threat before it has a chance to become one. It was the smart play, the safe play. Go inside, lock the door, pour a whiskey and wait for the coyotes to clean up the mess. By morning, it would be like it never happened. But then the boy's eyes met his. Across 20 feet of dusty, unforgiving ground, two worlds collided. In those dark, desperate eyes, Clayton didn't see a savage or an enemy. He saw a reflection, a ghost. He saw the son the fever had stolen from him 3 winters ago. The same age, the same dark hair, the same look of a boy trying to be a man long before his time. A curse escaped Clayton's lips, carried away by the wind. He leaned the rifle against the porch rail, the wood groaning in protest. Every step he took toward the fence felt like a betrayal of his neighbors, of his own safety, of the simple, brutal logic that had kept him alive this long. The boy, seeing him approach, tried to scramble backward. Fear gave him a momentary burst of strength, but the arrow lodged in his thigh scraped against bone, and he collapsed with a pained gasp. "Easy now," Clayton said, his voice rougher than he intended. He knelt, his old knees cracking. "I'm not going to hurt you." Blood was everywhere, a dark, ugly stain on the buckskin shirt. The arrows were broken off short, the work of someone trying to pull them out in a panic. Clayton had seen enough battlefields to know the wounds were bad, but they weren't a death sentence. Not yet. The boy started speaking, a torrent of words in a language Clayton didn't understand. But the tone was universal. He was pleading, begging. "What's your name, son?" Clayton asked, his hands already working to find a way to lift the boy without causing more pain. A single whispered word came back. "Kaya." Clayton grunted, hoisting the surprisingly light teenager into his arms. He was all bone and sinew, probably hadn't had a decent meal in a week. As he carried Kaya toward the cabin, a story of struggle and desperation written in the boy's thin frame, his boot heel came down on something soft. He looked down, and his blood turned to ice. Fresh tracks, not from the boy's desperate crawling. These were hoof prints, multiple horses, unshod native ponies. They hadn't just stumbled upon his ranch. They had been watching him the entire time. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of light against the encroaching darkness. Clayton lit every lamp he owned, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He laid Kaya on the kitchen table, the wood groaning under the unexpected burden. The arrow wounds needed immediate, unflinching attention. But as he turned to grab his medical kit, a dusty box filled with whiskey, clean rags, and a needle and thread, he saw it. Movement. Through the single grimy window, a silhouette detached itself from the tree line. Then another, and another. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace. They weren't just watching anymore. They were closing in. The cabin wasn't a shelter. It was a target, and he was standing right in the middle of it. As Clayton reached for a bottle of carbolic acid, a hand shot out and gripped his wrist. The strength was shocking, a desperate, wiry power that belied the boy's injuries. Kaya's eyes were wide, not with pain, but with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. He kept repeating a single word, his voice a hoarse, urgent whisper. "Washichu, Washichu." Clayton didn't speak Lakota, but he'd heard that word spit like a curse from other ranchers. It meant white man. But the way Kaya said it wasn't an accusation. It was a warning. The horrifying truth slammed into Clayton with the force of a physical blow. The boy wasn't afraid of the white man standing over him with a needle. He was afraid for him. The shadows in the pasture were no longer just shadows. They were men, and they were surrounding his home. He was trapped. But the most terrifying part? The boy on his table, the one he was trying to save, was the reason they were here. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. Clayton pressed a clean cloth to the wound on Ka's shoulder, trying to staunch the flow of blood. The boy winced, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. But he made no sound. His discipline was iron. Through the window, the silhouettes moved with chilling purpose. How many? 5? 10? Maybe more. They were ghosts in the twilight, appearing and disappearing between the gnarled oaks. "They're your people," Clayton said, the words barely a whisper. He wasn't even sure who he was talking to, the boy, or himself. "Why are you warning me about them?" Kaya's breathing was a painful rasp, but his eyes never left Clayton's face. He lifted a trembling hand, pointed weakly toward the window, and then drew a finger across his own throat. The message needed no translation. Clayton had heard the stories. The whispers traded over cheap whiskey in smoky saloons. When settlers took one of theirs, the tribes didn't send a sheriff with a warrant. They sent silent warriors in the dead of night. They didn't leave survivors. They left ashes and warnings. But this felt different. This wasn't the wild, chaotic rage of a revenge raid. This was controlled, coordinated. He continued to clean the wounds, his hands moving with the practiced calm of a man who had seen worse. He'd been a soldier, a long time ago. Before the ranch, before his wife, before the tiny grave he'd dug with his own 2 hands. He knew the difference between a mindless attack and what? A siege, an execution, a soft, low whistle cut through the night. It sounded like a nightjar, a common sound out here. But then, an identical call answered it from the opposite side of the cabin. They weren't just surrounding him. They were communicating. They were planning. Kaya's hand found his arm again, but this time the grip was different. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Gratitude, maybe? The boy spoke, and this time the words were English, fractured, heavily accented, but clear as a bell. "You could have left me." Clayton didn't look up from his work, threading a needle with a steady hand. "Yeah," he grunted. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" The question hung in the lamplit air, heavy and sharp. Why hadn't he? His neighbors would call him a fool, or worse, a traitor. Every instinct for self-preservation had screamed at him to turn his back, to let the prairie handle its own brutal justice. He thought of the small, unmarked grave under the old oak tree. "Had a son once," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "About your age." Kai was silent, but a deep, profound understanding passed between them, a shared grief that transcended language and blood. Another whistle from outside. Closer now. They were tightening the circle. Clayton could feel the noose pulling taut around his small, isolated world. He was a prisoner in his own home, the jailers silent, unseen figures in the dark. "Will they attack?" Clayton asked, his voice low. Ka closed his eyes, pain and something else. Resignation? Etched on his young face. "Depends." "Depends on what?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, locking onto Clayton's. They were old eyes in a young face, filled with a sorrow no 16-year-old should possess. "On whether they think you're like the others." Clayton knew exactly what that meant. The others were men like Jeremiah Holt and Boone Rollins, men who saw the native people not as neighbors, but as obstacles. Vermin to be cleared. He'd heard them brag about shooting at women and children just to spook them. They poisoned wells and broke treaties, then feigned surprise when the tribes retaliated. This whole bloody cycle was built on a mountain of small cruelties. His hand twitched, and the needle pricked his thumb. He cursed softly. "What's the difference?" he asked, more to himself than to the boy. "Between me and them?" Kaya watched him, his gaze intense, as if he were looking straight into Clayton's soul. "The others," he whispered, "would never have brought me inside." Just as the words left the boy's lips, a new sound shattered the tense silence. It wasn't the whisper of moccasins or the whistle of warriors. It was the hard, rhythmic pounding of shod horses, iron on stone, the sound of settlers, the sound of riders moving fast, with purpose. Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs. He ran to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Torches, a string of them, bobbing like angry fireflies in the distance, heading straight for his ranch. 4, maybe 5 riders. "My neighbors," Clayton said, his voice grim. "They must have seen the lights." Kaya struggled to sit up, his face a mask of pure panic. "They will kill us both!" The situation had gone from deadly to impossible. Outside, a circle of silent, patient warriors waited in the dark, and now, charging toward them, was a posse of angry, armed ranchers. The boy on his table wasn't a patient anymore. He was the fuse to a powder keg that was about to blow the entire valley apart. The drumming of hoofbeats grew into a deafening thunder. Voices, angry and sharp, carried on the night air. Clayton could pick out Jeremiah Holt's booming baritone, spitting words like tracks and stolen cattle, in time to send a message. They weren't coming for a friendly chat. They were a lynch mob looking for a rope. "Hide," Clayton hissed at Ka, pointing toward the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. The boy shook his head, his eyes blazing with a fierce pride. "No hiding. They smell blood. They will come looking." He was right. The cabin reeked of it. The coppery tang of Ka's wounds mixed with the sharp scent of medicinal herbs. It was a dead giveaway. There was no hiding what he'd done. Clayton grabbed his rifle from the porch rail just as 3 heavy knocks rattled the cabin door, making the lamps flicker. "Clayton, open up! It's Jeremiah!" Clayton took a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs. He could feel the eyes of the warriors in the trees on his back. He could feel the hatred of the men on his porch. He was caught between 2 worlds, and both of them wanted blood. He opened the door just a crack and slipped outside, pulling it shut behind him. 4 men on horseback stared down at him, their faces grim and shadowed by the flickering torchlight. Every one of them was armed to the teeth. They looked like the 4 horsemen of his own personal apocalypse. "Evening, Jeremiah," Clayton said, his voice a low, steady calm he did not feel. "What brings you boys out so late?" "Found a blood trail," Jeremiah said, his eyes not looking at Clayton, but scanning the cabin, the barn, the darkness beyond. "Starts 2 miles south, right where we found Hutchins' cattle scattered to hell and gone. Leads right here." Clayton shifted his weight, subtly blocking their view of the door. Behind him, he could hear a floorboard creak. Ka was moving. "Trail shows one of them was wounded bad," added Boone Rollins, a young hothead with eyes as cold as a winter river. "Ends at your fence line, Clayton. Funny, ain't it?" Sweat trickled down Clayton's spine. The horses were skittish, their nostrils flaring, their eyes wide. They could sense the unseen predators in the trees, even if their riders couldn't. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Jeremiah asked, but his hand was already resting on the butt of his pistol. It wasn't a question. "Actually," Clayton said, his voice quiet but hard as granite, "I do mind." The temperature in the yard seemed to drop 20 degrees. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto him, disbelief warring with suspicion. Jeremiah's face hardened. "That's a real interesting answer, Morse. Makes a man wonder what you're hiding." "Makes a man wonder why his neighbors are riding onto his land armed for war," Clayton shot back. Boone Rollins let out a short, ugly laugh. "Always were too soft, Morse. Even when you had a family to protect. Never had the stomach for what needs doing." The words were a physical blow. They had known his wife. They had stood by awkwardly as he lowered his own son into the cold ground. To have them twist his grief into a weapon, a red-hot rage, an emotion Clayton hadn't felt in years, coiled in his gut. He opened his mouth to say something he would have regretted for the rest of his life, but he never got the chance. A sound cut through the night, a low, menacing whistle, like the air itself was being torn in 2. Thwump! An arrow buried itself in the dirt, not 2 inches from the hoof of Jeremiah's horse. The animal screamed and reared, its eyes rolling in terror. Before anyone could even process what had happened, a second arrow sliced through the air. Thunk! It slammed into the porch post, the feathered shaft vibrating just beside Boone Rollins's head. He could have reached out and touched it. The message was brutally, terrifyingly clear. We can hit you whenever we want. The next one won't miss. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed and spun, their riders fighting for control as the primal fear of an ambush took hold. Jeremiah's torch fell, sputtering out in the dirt and plunging them into a terrifying, shifting world of shadows. Guns were drawn, barrels glinting in the moonlight, swinging wildly at enemies they couldn't see. Ambush! Boone shrieked, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager's. No, Clayton said, his voice cutting through the panic with an authority that surprised even himself. He stepped forward, placing his own body between the panicked ranchers and the unseen archers in the trees. It's a warning. Get out of the way, Morse! Jeremiah snarled, his rifle finally leveled, though his horse was still dancing nervously beneath him. They're all around us. Clayton stood his ground. Every instinct screamed at him to dive for cover, to let these two fires consume each other. But he couldn't. He was the only thing standing between a misunderstanding and a massacre. He could feel dozens of eyes on him from the darkness, judging, waiting. One wrong move, and his ranch would become a graveyard. Lower your weapons, Clayton commanded. All of you. Are you insane? Boone yelled, his face pale with a mixture of fear and rage. They just shot at us. They shot past you, Clayton corrected, his gaze unwavering. There's a big difference. The simple, terrifying truth of it began to settle over the ranchers. Warriors with that kind of skill could have put an arrow through each of their throats before they even knew what was happening. This wasn't an attack. It was a flex, a demonstration of absolute lethal power. Jeremiah finally calmed his horse enough to aim his rifle squarely at Clayton's chest. Step aside, Morse, or I'll assume you're with them. The weight of the moment was crushing. Behind him, a wounded boy. In front of him, a deluded mob. All around him, a silent army. And in the middle, just him, a tired, broken man who had already lost everything he'd ever cared about. What was one more loss? Jeremiah, Clayton said, his voice suddenly quiet, conversational. Your boy Marcus, he's about 16 now, isn't he? The question was so unexpected it threw Jeremiah completely off balance. What's that got to do with anything? If Marcus was lying out here, bleeding in the dirt, Clayton pressed, his eyes boring into Jeremiah's, and strangers found him, what would you want them to do? That's different, Jeremiah snapped, but the conviction in his voice wavered. Marcus ain't one of them. No, Clayton agreed softly, but he's still somebody's son. The words hung in the air. For a heart-stopping second, the only sound was the wind rustling through the tall grass. Clayton could see the war playing out on Jeremiah's face, the decent man he used to be fighting the hard, bitter man the frontier had made him. Then Boone shattered the moment. Enough of this talk, he roared. If you won't move, we'll go through you. He raised his pistol, the barrel a black hole in the moonlight, aimed directly at Clayton's heart. Time seemed to slow down. Clayton saw the hammer pull back. He heard the click. He braced himself for the flash, the impact, the end. Thwack! Another arrow. This one didn't hit the ground or a post. It moved with impossible speed and precision, slicing cleanly through the thick leather of Boone's holster. His pistol, ripped from its housing, tumbled through the air and landed uselessly in the dirt. Boone stared at his empty hip, then at the arrow that had seemingly appeared from nowhere, then at the darkness. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The message was even clearer this time. We can take your guns away whenever we want. Jesus Christ, one of the other riders whispered, his voice trembling. Clayton seized the opening. You need to leave, he said, his voice ringing with newfound power. Now. They'll follow us, Jeremiah said, his voice hollow. He finally understood how utterly outmatched they were. They'll pick us off one by one. No, they won't, Clayton replied, gambling everything on his read of the situation. He was betting his life and theirs that the warriors were here for one reason only, the boy in his cabin. Jeremiah stared at him, his face a mess of confusion, fear, and a dawning, grudging respect. Then slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his rifle. You're making a huge mistake, Clayton. Let me worry about that. One by one, the other riders holstered their weapons. They turned their horses, their confident charge having devolved into a panicked retreat. But as they spurred their mounts away, Boone twisted in his saddle, his face a mask of pure hatred. "This ain't over, Morse. Next time, we bring the whole damn territory, and we won't be asking permission." Clayton watched them go, the sound of their hoofbeats fading into the night. Only when they were completely gone did he let out the breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. His legs felt like water. His hands were shaking. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Kaya stood there leaning against the frame. He was pale, sweating, but his eyes were clear. "You could have died," the boy said. "Yeah," Clayton breathed. "So could you." A new sound came from the darkness, not a whistle this time. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was approaching, making no attempt to hide. This wasn't a scout. This was a leader. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping over the fence as if it wasn't there. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from ancient stone. Eagle feathers were woven into his long black hair, and intricate patterns of war paint marked his weathered skin. His presence was immense, radiating a quiet, dangerous authority. Ka immediately straightened up, ignoring his injuries, and began speaking rapidly in his native tongue. The warrior listened, his face impassive, but his dark, intelligent eyes never left Clayton. When the boy finished, a heavy silence fell. "You are Clayton Morse," the warrior said. His English was accented but perfect. It was a statement, not a question. I am Dakota. Ka is my sister's son." He gestured to the boy. "My nephew tells me you chose to help when you could have chosen to harm." Clayton just nodded, acutely aware that unseen warriors were still out there, arrows likely knocked and aimed at his heart. "The men who came here," Dakota continued, his voice a low rumble. "They wanted to take him?" "They wanted to hang him," Clayton corrected grimly. "Or worse." A flicker of something, cold fire, danced in Dakota's eyes. "And you stopped them." "They had some help," Clayton said, glancing toward the trees. "You did not ask for that help," Dakota countered, stepping closer. Now they were only feet apart. "But you accepted it. Why?" The question of the night. Why? Clayton thought of his son. He thought of the man he was versus the man he wanted to be. He thought of the promise he'd made at that tiny gravesite, a promise to honor his boy's memory by being a good man in a hard world. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. Dakota studied him for a long, unnerving moment. Then, to Clayton's utter astonishment, the corners of his mouth turned up in a slight, grim smile. "My nephew said the same of you. He said you brought him into your home, tended his wounds, risked your own life for him. Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Dakota said, the smile vanishing. His voice was firm, filled with the weight of bitter experience. "Most would not. We have learned this lesson many times." Kaya spoke again, a short, pained sentence. Dakota listened, then looked back at Clayton. "He says you lost a son." The words hit Clayton like a physical blow. He felt his throat tighten, the old grief rising up to choke him. 3 years ago, the fever. "We lost children to that fever too," Dakota said, his voice softening with a shared ancient pain. "Sickness does not see the color of a man's skin. You understand what it is to lose family." Clayton could only nod, not trusting his voice. Suddenly, Dakota reached into a leather pouch at his waist. "My nephew cannot travel tonight. He needs to heal." "He can stay here," Clayton offered without hesitation. "And when your neighbors return?" Dakota asked, his eyes sharp. "They will not come with 4 men. They will come with 40. It was the thought Clayton had been trying to push away. Boone's threat hadn't been idle boasting. By sunrise, word would be all over the valley. Clayton Morse, the traitor, siding with savages against his own kind. "We'll deal with that when it happens," Clayton said, with more confidence than he felt. Dakota extended his open hand. Resting in his palm was a small, exquisitely carved eagle, fashioned from polished black stone. "This belonged to my nephew's father," Dakota said. "My brother. He died protecting our people from soldiers. He would want you to have it." He pressed the carving into Clayton's hand. It was cool to the touch, but it felt as heavy as a cannonball. It was more than a gift. It was a treaty, a bond, an offer of trust between 2 men who had every reason in the world to kill each other. Clayton opened his mouth to respond, to say thank you, to say anything. But the night was not finished with them yet. From the direction the ranchers had fled, a sound ripped across the valley. Gunshots. 3 of them, fired in quick succession, followed by a faint panicked shout. Then a terrifying silence. Dakota's head snapped toward the sound, his entire body going rigid. All around the property, in the deep shadows, Clayton could hear the rustle of movement, the soft whisper of boughs being drawn. The fragile peace had just been shattered. What was that? Clayton asked, though a cold dread was already coiling in his stomach. He knew what it was. It was the sound of Boone Rollins making good on his promise. Dakota closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the subtle language of the night. When he opened them, his expression was grim. More riders. Many more. Kaya, hearing this, pushed himself off the doorframe and staggered forward, ignoring Clayton's protests. "We brought this to you," the boy said, his voice filled with shame. "We must go." "You're not going anywhere," Clayton said, grabbing his arm. "Not unless you want to bleed out before you clear my fence line." The sound was unmistakable now. It wasn't 4 horses or even 5. It was an army, a cavalry charge of furious, vengeful men. A sea of torches was moving across the prairie, a wave of fire and hate rolling directly toward them. "How many men can your neighbors gather in a night?" Dakota asked, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. Clayton did the grim math. 20, 30 maybe, all of them angry, all of them armed. "And how many warriors do you think I brought with me?" Dakota asked. "I counted maybe 10 shadows." A grim smile touched Dakota's lips. 15. But numbers will not matter if they come for blood. The cold, hard reality of it crashed down on Clayton. He had made his stand. He had chosen his side. But the consequences wouldn't be his alone to bear. When the shooting started, men would die. Good men, bad men, it wouldn't matter. The valley would be soaked in blood, and the hatred it spawned would poison this land for generations. "There has to be another way," Clayton said, his voice pleading. "And what do you suggest?" Dakota asked, his eyes on the approaching torches. "Your people believe we are thieves and killers. Their ears are closed to reason." The posse was close now, close enough to make out individual riders. Jeremiah was at the head, but behind him were faces from every settlement in the territory. They had ridden all night, their anger and fear feeding on each other, growing into a monster. "They want justice," Clayton argued weakly. "They want revenge," Dakota corrected. Suddenly, Ka spoke up, his voice weak but clear. "Uncle, there is something you should know about the cattle." Both men turned to look at him. "We did not take them," Ka said, his eyes burning with intensity. "But I know who did." The riders had reached his fence. There must have been 40 of them, a grim, silent wall of men and horses. They weren't coming to talk. They were deploying, spreading out, surrounding the cabin in a textbook military maneuver. Time was up. "Who?" Clayton demanded. "Who took the cattle?" "White men," Ka said, spitting the words. 3 of them. They drove the herd north toward the mining camps. We followed them. I shot one of them before they got away. "Why didn't you tell the ranchers?" Clayton asked, his mind reeling. Kaya let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "And would they believe the word of a savage against one of their own? Or would they say we were lying to cover our own tracks?" He was right. It would have been his word against theirs. A pointless, dangerous gesture. "Can you prove this?" Dakota asked his nephew, his voice sharp. "The tracks are there," Ka insisted. "And the man I shot, he was a big man, with a beard like fire." Clayton's blood went cold. He knew that description. There was only one man in this territory who fit it. A man feared by settlers and natives alike. "Red McKinnon," Clayton breathed. "You know this man?" Dakota asked. "Everyone knows him. Cattle rustler. Killer for hire. He's wanted in 3 territories. He uses the fighting between us, between our peoples, as a cover. He starts a fire and loots the house while everyone is busy trying to put it out." It all made a horrible, perfect sense. McKinnon's gang steals the cattle. They leave clues pointing toward the local tribe. The enraged ranchers form a posse and ride out for revenge. And while the 2 sides are busy killing each other, McKinnon sells the stolen herd to the mining camps. No questions asked. It was brilliant, and it was pure evil. The posse had formed a complete circle around his property. Jeremiah spurred his horse forward, stopping just out of what he assumed was arrow range. "Clayton Morse!" His voice boomed across the yard. "We know you're in there. We know you're harboring hostiles. Send them out now, and we might let you live." Clayton stepped out onto the porch, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. He could feel the weight of Dakota and Ka at his back. He could feel the cold eyes of 15 warriors in the trees, and he could feel the burning hatred of 40 of his own people. The entire world was balanced on his next words. "Jeremiah, you're making a mistake. Your cattle weren't stolen by natives." "That's a convenient story, Morse," Jeremiah yelled back. "It's the truth. They were taken by Red McKinnon's gang. The boy in here, he saw them. He wounded one of them." "The word of a savage!" It was Boone Rollins, his face a twisted mask of contempt. "You expect us to believe that garbage?" Clayton saw it in their eyes. It was too late. Their minds were made up. Reason was a foreign language they no longer understood. They had come for blood, and they wouldn't leave without it. This was how it was going to end, in a pointless, stupid blaze of gunfire. But then Dakota moved. He stepped out from the shadows of the cabin and walked into the center of the yard, bathed in the torchlight for all to see. He was magnificent and terrifying, a true warrior king. "I am Dakota of the Lakota," he called out, his powerful voice silencing the murmuring crowd. "I am the leader of these warriors. If it is a fight you want, it is a fight you will have. But first, you will hear the truth." A ripple of unease went through the posse. This wasn't some scared teenager. This was a man who radiated power, a man who was not afraid of them. Jeremiah held up a hand, silencing the few who had raised their rifles. "Speak your piece," Jeremiah said, his voice tight, "but make it quick." "3 suns ago," Dakota began, his voice calm and steady, "my nephew saw white men, thieves, driving your stolen cattle north. One of them was a large man with hair the color of fire on his face. My nephew put an arrow in his shoulder before they escaped." "Red McKinnon," a voice called out from the back of the posse. "He's got a red beard. Been hitting ranches all over this valley." "Shut up, Davies," Boone snapped. But the seed of doubt had been planted. McKinnon was a known plague on all their houses. "Your cattle bear your brands, do they not?" Dakota continued, his voice resonating with irrefutable logic. "Go, check the mining camps to the north. You will find your cattle there, and you will find they were sold by white men, not by my people. They use your hatred of us to make themselves rich." "Even if that's true," Jeremiah argued, his certainty clearly shaken, "it doesn't change the fact that you are trespassing." "We came only for our own," Dakota replied, gesturing toward the cabin. "For my sister's son. This man," he pointed to Clayton, "chose mercy when your people chose violence. He risked his life to save a boy he did not know, a boy you came here tonight to murder." Clayton felt the weight of every eye in the valley on him. His life, his future, the fate of everyone here hung on what Jeremiah would decide. "Why should we believe a word of this?" Boone demanded, trying to reclaim control. Before anyone could answer, a new sound came from the north. A single horse galloping flat out, being pushed to its absolute limit. A rider burst into the torchlight, his horse lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. It was Tom Davies, the man who had spoken McKinnon's name. He'd clearly broken from the group to do some scouting of his own. "Jeremiah," he gasped, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. "I found him. Tracks. A whole herd heading north, just like he said. And there's blood on the rocks, right where someone would have been shot with an arrow." A dead, profound silence fell over the yard. The wind whispered through the grass. A horse snorted. But no man spoke a word. The posse looked at each other, their righteous fury evaporating, being replaced by a sickening, dawning horror. They were wrong. They had almost started a war, almost murdered a man and a boy, based on a lie. "Coincidence," Boone stammered, his voice weak. "It could be proof," Clayton countered, stepping forward. "The question is, Jeremiah, are you willing to kill us all on the chance that you're wrong?" Dakota stepped forward as well, his eyes locked on Jeremiah. "I will make you a promise. Send your men to the camps. If you find your cattle, you will know the truth. If you do not, he shrugged, a simple, eloquent gesture, then we will face your justice. All of us. And in the meantime, Jeremiah asked, his voice barely a whisper, in the meantime, my nephew heals. Under this good man's roof, when he is strong enough to travel, we will leave your lands, and we will not return. The logic was undeniable. The offer was more than fair. But years of hatred and suspicion were a hard poison to overcome. Clayton could see the struggle on Jeremiah's face. Then the cabin door opened one last time. Ka stepped out, leaning heavily on the doorframe, but standing on his own 2 feet. In the flickering torchlight, he looked impossibly young, a child playing at being a warrior. Clayton let the silence stretch. Then he asked the question that would change everything. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every man in the yard. This is who you came here to kill? A wounded boy? And slowly, one by one, the rifles began to lower. Jeremiah was the first. With a heavy sigh, he slid his rifle back into its scabbard. That single act was a signal. Across the yard, the sound of metal sliding against leather rippled through the posse as men holstered their weapons. Not all of them. Boone and a few of his cronies kept their guns out, their faces sullen and angry, but the tide had turned. The thirst for blood had been broken. 3 days, Jeremiah said, his voice raw. We'll send riders to the camps. 3 days. You will find what you are looking for, Dakota said with quiet certainty. Clayton felt a wave of relief, so powerful his knees almost buckled. But it wasn't over. Not yet. And what's to stop them from raiding us the second we're gone? Boone snarled. We leave now. We're leaving our backs wide open. I'll vouch for them, Clayton said, stepping forward. They stay here, on my property, under my watch. Your word? Boone sneered. After tonight, your word ain't worth spit. But Dakota had an answer. Choose 3 of your own men, he said to Jeremiah. Let them stay. They can make their camp where they can see this cabin. They can watch our every move. If we break our word, they can ride for the alarm. The offer was brilliant in its simplicity. It was a gesture of trust that also served as a guarantee. Jeremiah knew it was a good deal. After a long moment, he nodded. Davies, you, Miller, and Hutchins, you stay, you watch. Anything happens, you ride like the devil himself is on your tail. The 3 men looked less than thrilled, but they dismounted, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. The rest of the posse began to turn away, their grand charge ending in a confused, anticlimactic retreat. This had better be the truth, Clayton, Jeremiah called over his shoulder. Because if this is some kind of trick, it's not, Clayton said, and you'll know it soon enough. The torches disappeared back into the night, leaving only the small campfire of the 3 watchers. Dakota spoke quietly to the darkness, and most of the unseen warriors melted back into the wilderness. Only a few remained, Clayton knew, to watch the watchers. The next 2 days were the longest of Clayton's life. He, Dakota, and the recovering Ka were prisoners in the cabin, under the constant, suspicious gaze of the 3 ranchers camped by the fence. An uneasy truce held. They were 2 warring camps, separated by 100 yards of dirt and a generation of mistrust. Inside, a strange peace settled. Clayton and Dakota talked. They didn't talk about the fighting, or the land, or the grievances between their peoples. They talked about their sons. Dakota spoke of the boy he had lost to the same fever that had taken Clayton's. They were just 2 fathers, sharing a grief that knew no language or color. In those quiet hours, a bridge was built between them, fragile but real. At dawn on the 3rd day, a rider appeared on the horizon. A single rider, moving fast. Every man, settler, and native alike held his breath. It was Jeremiah. He rode straight to the fence line, dismounted, and walked to the cabin. His face was unreadable, carved from stone. Clayton's heart hammered in his chest as he opened the door. Found 'em, Jeremiah said, his voice flat. Every last one of Hutchins' cattle, and 3 other herds from up valley, all at the mining camp. Relief washed over Clayton, so pure and potent it was dizzying. And McKinnon? Got shot trying to run, Jeremiah said. He looked past Clayton, at Kaye, who was now standing, weak but whole. Territorial Marshal said he had an old arrow wound in his shoulder, still fresh. He looked at the boy. Your aim is pretty good, son. Ka just nodded. Jeremiah shuffled his feet, looking at the ground, at the sky, at anything but Clayton and Dakota. Look, he mumbled, it seems we owe you an apology. Dakota stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway. Apologies are not needed, he said, his voice deep and resonant. Only understanding. That was the beginning. Word spread. The truth about McKinnon, about Clayton's stand, about Dakota's wisdom. The story became a legend in the valley. The crisis was over, but something new had been planted. Something fragile, but hopeful. When Ka was strong enough to ride, Dakota gathered his warriors. As they prepared to leave, he paused at Clayton's door. He held out the small carved eagle. My people have a custom, he said. When a man performs a great act of courage and kindness, we honor him. This carving, it marks you as a friend, an ally. Any of my people who see it will know that this is a safe place, that the man who lives here has a true heart. I don't need any honors, Clayton said gruffly. Perhaps not, Dakota said with a rare smile, but you have earned it. They left, and for the first time in a long time, the silence that settled over the ranch felt like peace, not loneliness. But the story doesn't end there. The next morning at the first light of dawn, Clayton walked onto his porch with a cup of coffee, and he stopped dead. His entire yard was filled with riders. Dakota, Ka, and all 15 warriors sat on their ponies in perfect, silent formation. Their war paint gleamed in the rising sun. They weren't there to threaten, they were there to honor. As Clayton stepped into view, every single warrior raised his right hand in the universal sign of respect. No words were spoken, none were needed. It was a silent salute, a promise, a thank you from one nation to one good man. Then as one, they turned their horses and rode east, disappearing into the sunrise. Clayton stood on that porch for a long, long time, the small stone eagle clutched in his hand. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face, and for the first time since he had buried his son, Clayton Morse smiled. He had faced down his own people, stared into the barrels of their guns, and risked everything, not for land, or for money, or for pride, but because it was the right thing to do. If this story reminded you that one person's courage can change the world, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because the stories we tell here are about the moments that define us, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.